On a spring afternoon in 2008, a small team of geneticists sequencing pigmentation genes for a forensic genetics project stumbled onto a single letter of DNA that would rewrite everything we thought we understood about eye color. Buried in intron 86 of a gene called HERC2 on chromosome 15 sat a switch known today as rs129138832. Flip it one way, and a person's eyes turn brown. Flip it the other, and they turn blue. It seemed almost too simple, too elegant, for something as visually complex and hauntingly variable as the human iris, that most intimate and most stared into part of the human face. But there was a problem the researchers could not explain away. Green eyes did not fit the switch. They were not simply half brown and half blue. They were something else entirely, something rarer, something the tidy new model could not account for. And when scientists began asking where green eyes actually come from, the geography of the answer turned out to be almost unbelievable. Ireland and Scotland, yes, that much everyone expected, but also the mountains of Afghanistan, the valleys of the Caucasus. Isolated tribal communities in northern Pakistan who had never had meaningful contact with northern Europe in any remembered history. Two populations, thousands of miles apart, separated by different religions, different languages, different diets, different climates, sharing a strikingly similar and genuinely rare trait. For a long time, this was treated as a curiosity and nothing more, a coincidence of evolution. Or maybe a leftover rumor from Alexander the Great's soldiers wandering into the Hindu Kush. But over the last 15 years, as genome sequencing became fast enough and cheap enough to examine ordinary people at the level of individual letters of DNA, a very different and far stranger picture began to surface. This is not a story about one gene. It is not a story about one migration or one army or one legend. It is a story about two populations, one in the far west of Europe and one in the mountainous heart of Asia, who may be carrying forward the same ancient genetic signature from a source population that existed before either Europe or Asia meant anything at all. Let's start with what most of us think we know, because most of what we think we know is wrong. For decades, popular science explained eye color the way a high school biology textbook explains it. One gene, brown dominant, blue recessive, green somewhere vaguely in the middle as a kind of genetic compromise. Punnett squares got drawn on whiteboards, students memorized the diagram, and the subject was closed. The real biology, once researchers had the tools to actually look, turned out to be dramatically more complicated. At least a dozen genes contribute meaningfully to human eye color, but two of them, OCA2 and HERC2, sitting side by side on chromosome 15, do the vast majority of the work for the basic blue to brown spectrum. That switch, discovered in 2008, or rs2913832, sits inside HERC2, but actually controls its neighbor, OCA2, by acting as a long-range enhancer. When the derived version of that switch is present in both copies a person inherits, OCA2 expression drops sharply, melanin production in the iris falls with it, and the eye reads as blue. Two copies of the ancestral version, and OCA2 stays highly active, melanin builds up in the iris stroma, and the eye reads as brown. It is an elegant mechanism, and it explains a huge amount of variation across European populations in particular. Green, though, does not slot neatly into this binary. Green eyes appear to emerge from a narrower, more delicate combination of factors. A moderate, rather than extreme reduction in melanin, the scattering of light through the collagen structure of the iris in a way that produces a Rayleigh scattering effect, similar to what makes the sky blue, a small contribution of yellow pigment called lipofuscin, and input from a handful of secondary genes, including SLC24A4, TYR, TYRP1, and IRF4. In genetic terms, green is a knife-edge phenotype. Too much melanin reduction, and the eye slides into blue. Too little, and it slides back into brown or hazel. Green sits in a narrow band that is much harder to hit, which is precisely why global estimates put green eyes at somewhere around 2% of the world's population, making it by most measures the rarest eye color on Earth, even though in certain regional pockets, especially parts of northern and western Europe, the local frequency climbs dramatically higher. This narrowness is exactly why eye color has become useful in an entirely different field, forensic DNA phenotyping, the practice of predicting a person's physical appearance directly from crime scene DNA when no suspect and no database match exists. Prediction systems built around markers like rs1293832 can call blue versus brown eyes with a very high degree of accuracy from DNA alone, but green remains the stubborn outlier, the category these systems still struggle with most, precisely because it depends on a delicate balance of several genes rather than one dominant switch. In a strange way, the same genetic complexity that makes green eyes so rare in the population is the same complexity that makes them so hard for a machine or a courtroom or a textbook to fully explain. When researchers began mapping these pigmentation variants across large population datasets, biobanks out of the United Kingdom, Iceland, and Scandinavia, They expected a clean gradient, lightest features clustering in the far north, darkest features clustering near the equator, with everything in between following a smooth cline. For blue eyes, this model works reasonably well. The blue associated version of RS129133832 appears to have originated somewhere near the Black Sea or the Pontic-Caspian steppe region, spreading outward with early farming populations and later amplified to very high frequency by steppe pastoralist migrations into Central and Northern Europe. Green eyes refuse to follow that same clean script. In Europe, the green-eyed population concentrates heavily along the Atlantic edge of the continent, a belt running through Ireland, Scotland, Wales, parts of northern France, the Low Countries, Iceland, and western Scandinavia. Genetic studies of these populations show green eyes correlating strongly with particular combinations of OCA2 and HERC2 variants that produce intermediate rather than fully reduced pigmentation. And they also correlate with variation in SLC45A2, a gene with broad effects on skin and eye lightening, and with MC1R, the gene most famous for red hair and the fair, freckle-prone skin common across the Atlantic fringe of Europe. In other words, the genetic architecture behind European green eyes sits inside a much larger complex of light pigmentation traits that appear to have been under strong positive selection in low ultraviolet, high-latitude environments, roughly over the past 10 to 15,000 years. Ancient DNA has actually made this story stranger and more interesting than the tidy version usually told. The famous Mesolithic skeleton known as Cheddar Man, recovered from Gough's Cave in Britain and dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, turned out when sequenced to have almost certainly carried blue eyes, alongside notably dark skin, an unexpected combination that surprised researchers when it was announced. A similar pattern turned up in Labrana, a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer from northern Spain, dated to around 7,000 years ago, who also carried light eye variants on a dark-skinned genome. In other words, light eye alleles were already circulating among Western European hunter-gatherer populations thousands of years before agriculture, before the Celts, before anything resembling a modern ethnic identity existed on the continent. But the story does not move in a straight line from there to modern Ireland. When researchers at Trinity College Dublin sequenced the first ancient Irish genomes in 2015, the Neolithic farming woman they recovered from a megalithic tomb near Belfast, dated to roughly 3300 BC, turned out to have black hair and brown eyes, carrying predominantly Near Eastern farmer ancestry that had partially displaced the older hunter-gatherer pigmentation profile when agriculture arrived on the island. It was not until the Bronze Age, specifically 3 men buried on Rathlin Island roughly 2,000 years later, that blue eye variants and the broader light pigmentation package reappear at high frequency in the Irish genetic record, arriving alongside a substantial wave of steppe ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian region that also reshaped the Y chromosome landscape of the British Isles and may be connected to the eventual arrival of early Celtic language itself. So the honest version of the story is not a single unbroken thread of green-eyed ancestors stretching back to the last ice age. It is closer to a relay race, ancient hunter-gatherer populations carrying light eye alleles deep into prehistory, a partial eclipse of that trait when Near Eastern farmers arrived, and then a dramatic re-amplification when steppe herders swept through roughly 4,000 years ago, embedding blue and green-eyed ancestry permanently into the populations we now think of as Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. The romantic idea of the green-eyed Celt does have a genuine biological basis, but that basis is layered, interrupted, and considerably older and stranger than the simple story usually told about it. Now take that picture and travel roughly 4,000 miles east into the mountain corridor running from eastern Turkey through Georgia, Armenia, and the North Caucasus, curving south and east through northern Iran, Afghanistan, and the tribal regions of northern Pakistan. Green and hazel green eyes appear here at frequencies that can rival, and in some communities apparently exceed, what is found in parts of Ireland. Among the Pashtun, one of the largest tribal ethnic groups in the world, numbering in the tens of millions, light eyes including green are documented at noticeably elevated rates in certain tribal communities. Among Chechens, Circassians, Abkhaz, and other peoples of the North Caucasus, green and hazel eyes are strikingly common, often paired with dark hair, a combination almost never seen together in northwestern Europe. Among the small and remarkable Nuristani people of northeastern Afghanistan, a mountain population historically known to outsiders as the Kafir peoples before their conversion to Islam in the 19th century, light-colored eyes, including green, are common enough that ancient Greek chroniclers accompanying Alexander the Great reportedly remarked on the unusual appearance of local populations in that region more than 2,000 years ago. The Nuristanis remain largely isolated in their steep valleys for most of recorded history, protected as much by punishing terrain as by any deliberate choice, and that isolation is precisely the kind of environment population geneticists point to when a rare trait needs an explanation beyond ordinary chance. For generations, The explanation offered for all of this was romantic and almost entirely unsupported by genetics, that these were the descendants of Alexander's soldiers, stray Greek colonists, wandering crusaders, or garrisons of Roman legionaries who somehow left their mark on isolated mountain communities. It makes for wonderful folklore. It is, according to the genetic evidence, almost certainly not what happened. When research groups in Pakistan working alongside European genomics teams began comprehensively sequencing Pashtun, Kalash, and Nuristani genomes starting in the early 2010s, the picture that emerged reshaped the entire question. The green-eyed phenotype in these West and Central Asian populations does share some of the same core functional variants found in European green-eyed individuals, particularly around the OCA2-HERE-C2 region. But the surrounding haplotype, the block of DNA inherited together around that variant, tells a different and much older story. In these West Asian populations, the relevant chromosome 15 haplotype sits on a genetic background that appears to have diverged from the European lineage extremely deep in time, with some estimates from population genetic modeling placing the split at tens of thousands of years ago, long before anything resembling the ethnic or national categories we use today existed. When this finding first appeared in the scientific literature, the obvious and comfortable explanation was convergent evolution, the idea that two separate populations independently evolved similar-looking pigmentation traits under different selective pressures, arriving at the same visible outcome by coincidence. That would have been the tidy answer. It is not, however, the answer the molecular data supports. The functional variants shared between European and West Asian green-eyed populations appear to be identical by descent, rather than merely identical by chance mutation, meaning they share enough surrounding genetic sequence that independent origin is extremely unlikely from a statistical standpoint. What the evidence points toward instead is a shared ancestral population, likely situated somewhere in or near the Caucasus, the Iranian Plateau, or the broader zone geneticists sometimes describe as part of the ancient North Eurasian genetic sphere, a population that carried these intermediate pigmentation variants before the ancestors of modern Europeans and modern West and Central Asians fully split apart. In other words, the green-eyed allele complex looks like a molecular relic from a time before European and Asian were meaningful genetic categories at all, carried forward independently into two very different daughter populations, who went on to build entirely separate civilizations, religions, and languages, all while quietly transporting the same ancient pigmentation signature in their blood. There is a broader body of ancient DNA work on Bronze Age Central Asia, including sites associated with the Yamnaya-related steppe cultures and the Bronze Age oasis civilization known as the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex in what is now Turkmenistan, that has helped researchers trace how populations moved and mixed across this vast Central Eurasian corridor. Taken together with the pigmentation genetics, the emerging picture suggests that light eye variants were not simply carried in a single direction from west to east or east to west. Instead, they appear to have radiated outward from a broad central zone, moving west into Europe alongside early farmer and later steppe pastoralist migrations, and moving east and south into Central and South Asia along largely separate demographic pathways over thousands of years. Here is where this story becomes genuinely fascinating, because despite sharing this deep ancestral origin, European and West Central Asian green-eyed populations have followed dramatically different evolutionary paths for tens of thousands of years since that split. Their genetics converge in ancient ancestry, but diverge sharply in mechanism. In Europe, light pigmentation underwent intense positive selection beginning in the Mesolithic and accelerating through the Neolithic transition to agriculture, a shift widely linked to the need for efficient vitamin D synthesis in low ultraviolet, high latitude environments, and possibly compounded by dietary changes, as grain-based agriculture replaced a more fish and game-heavy diet. Population genetic modeling suggests that some of the relevant light pigmentation alleles rose from low frequency to near dominance in a relatively short evolutionary window, which requires unusually strong selective pressure. Green eyes in Europe appear to be part of this broader selected package, a package that reduces melanin across skin, hair, and eyes together, and which conferred a real survival advantage at high latitudes where every bit of available ultraviolet light matters for producing adequate vitamin D. In West and Central Asia, the selective landscape looks almost nothing alike. Ultraviolet exposure remains meaningfully higher even at altitude, vitamin D deficiency pressure is comparatively weaker, and skin tone across these populations remains relatively olive or medium-toned rather than pale, and yet green eyes persist in some isolated mountain communities at genuinely striking frequencies. So what is actually maintaining the trait if the obvious vitamin D explanation does not apply here? The most credible answer researchers point to combines two separate forces. First, straightforward genetic drift acting inside small, geographically isolated mountain populations. The Caucasus and the Hindu Kush are landscapes of extreme fragmentation, valley after valley cut off from its neighbors by terrain that made regular contact difficult for most of human history. Communities numbering in the hundreds or low thousands, repeatedly reduced further by war, famine, and disease, experience powerful genetic drift, the random amplification or loss of traits purely by chance rather than by selection. And that kind of drift can push a rare variant to unusually high local frequency across enough generations. Small, isolated communities of this kind are, in a sense, natural laboratories for exactly this process, since a variant that might sit at low, unremarkable frequency across a population of millions can, purely through the accidents of who happens to survive and reproduce in a given generation, climb toward local prominence within a valley of a few thousand people over the course of only a handful of centuries. Second, there's a long-documented cultural dimension worth taking seriously, even if it resists the kind of precise quantification a laboratory experiment would offer. Traditional poetry and oral literature in both Pashto and Chechen cultural traditions repeatedly celebrate green eyes, specifically as an ideal of beauty, not blue, not gray, specifically green. Cultural preference of this kind, sustained across many generations through marriage patterns and social prestige, could plausibly act as a mild but persistent selective pressure layered on top of drift, even without a formal clinical study proving the effect size. It is an area where the genetics is solid and the cultural explanation is a reasonable, well-supported hypothesis rather than a hard-measured fact. And it is worth being honest about that distinction rather than pretending otherwise. There is one more thread in this story too remarkable to leave out. Among the Kalash people of Pakistan's Chitral district, a small population of only a few thousand individuals who practice a unique polytheistic religion entirely distinct from their Muslim neighbors, green and blue eyes paired with light brown hair appear at rates striking enough that they became a subject of intense scientific curiosity. Sensational reporting through the 1990s repeated the old legend that the Kalash were the literal descendants of Alexander the Great's stranded soldiers, a lost European tribe preserved in isolation for over 2,000 years. When their genomes were finally sequenced comprehensively in a landmark 2015 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, led by researchers in Pakistan working with international collaborators, the actual picture turned out to be more subtle and considerably more interesting than the legend. That study found the Kalash to be an extraordinarily drifted ancient population, sharing deep genetic ties with Paleolithic-era Siberian hunter-gatherer lineages. The same broad ancient North Eurasian ancestry echoed in the wider Central Asian green eye story, with no strong evidence in that particular analysis of a substantial recent European admixture event tied to Alexander's campaigns. It is worth noting, in fairness, that the picture is not entirely settled. A separate research group published a rebuttal the following year arguing that a different analytical method did detect a more recent admixture pulse into the Kalash gene pool, dated to somewhere between roughly 1,000 and 200 years before the Common Era, a period that would predate Alexander's actual invasion of the region, but still overlaps with a broader era of West Eurasian contact. Geneticists continue to debate exactly how much, if any, of that later signal reflects real population movement versus statistical noise in the modeling. What both sides of that debate agree on, however, is that the Kalash are not simply misplaced Greeks. They are, at minimum, a genuinely ancient and unusually isolated population, carrying forward pigmentation variants that trace back to a source far older than Alexander, far older than Rome, and far older than any conquering army that popular legend has tried to credit. So what does it actually mean that a Pashtun grandmother in Jalalabad and an Irish fisherman in Galway may be carrying the same ancient genetic signature for eye color, a signature tracing back to a shared ancestral population that existed before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before any religion or ethnic identity practiced anywhere on Earth today? It means, first, that visible appearance is a remarkably poor proxy for recent ancestry. Green eyes do not make someone European. Green eyes do not make someone Central Asian. They make someone a carrier of a set of molecular variants that predate the very categories we use to sort humanity into familiar, comfortable boxes. The next time someone assumes that a green-eyed child from Afghanistan must have hidden European blood, they are wrong in the most fundamental genetic sense. Not because there is no connection at all, but because that connection reaches back to a depth of time where the label European simply does not apply yet. The relevant alleles are, in a very real sense, older than Europe as a meaningful genetic or cultural grouping. It means, second, that our instinct to read surface traits as evidence of close relatedness rests on a misunderstanding that is easy to overlook. The exact same genetic variant, riding on entirely different chromosomal backgrounds, shaped by entirely different selective pressures, in populations that have not meaningfully exchanged genes for tens of thousands of years, can still produce the same visible outcome. Appearance, on its own, is one of the shallowest possible measures of biological relationship that exists. Two green-eyed people from opposite sides of the world may, in total genomic terms, share far less in common with each other than either one shares with a brown-eyed neighbor from their own village. It means, third, that the continental categories we tend to experience as ancient, fixed, and self-evident are, genetically speaking, much younger and far more porous than most of us assume. The genome remembers a period before those divisions ever crystallized, and it carries forward, silently, in every generation, molecular evidence of a shared and much deeper past that no oral tradition, no sacred text, and no cultural memory ever managed to preserve on its own. It also means something a little humbling for anyone tempted to draw a straight line from a single physical trait to a tidy origin story. The green-eyed Afghan child, the red-haired Berber, the blue-eyed Siberian, all of them are living reminders that the deep human past was messier, more interconnected, and considerably less tidy than the national and ethnic categories that came much later and were, in evolutionary terms, invented practically yesterday. Population geneticists sometimes describe this as the difference between a tree and a trellis. The old model of human ancestry imagined clean branching, one population splitting cleanly from another, each branch acquiring its own distinct traits in isolation, never touching again. The actual genomic record looks far more like a trellis, a lattice of contact, separation, recontact, and exchange, repeated many times over tens of thousands of years, with traits like eye color hitching a ride across that lattice in ways that rarely respect the boundaries we like to draw after the fact. The next time you look to a pair of green eyes, whether in a mirror, across a dinner table, or in a photograph taken 8 time zones away, you are looking at one of the more elegant demonstrations biology has to offer, not primarily of difference, although difference is certainly part of the picture, but of depth, of a shared and ancient past so old that it quietly humbles almost every neat story humans have ever told about who belongs with whom and why. The color itself is not really Eastern and it is not really Western. It is simply old, older than any of our civilizations, older than our religions, older by a wide margin than our confidence about exactly where one people is supposed to end and another is supposed to begin. Scientists are still refining the exact timeline, still arguing over which studies get the admixture dates right and which ones need revision, and that ongoing disagreement is itself worth remembering, because it means the full story of green eyes has not actually finished being written. New ancient genomes are sequenced every year, from new burial sites in the Caucasus, from new excavations across the Iranian plateau, from overlooked archives of skeletal materials sitting in museum basements waiting for a sequencing machine, and each new genome has the potential to nudge the accepted timeline a little further back, or reveal a migration route nobody had previously mapped. What will not change, no matter how the specific dates and models get revised, is the basic and now well-supported finding that a rare and striking eye color connects mountain villages in Afghanistan to farmhouses in rural Ireland through a common ancestor that predates every flag, every border, and every story we currently tell about who we are. In the end, whatever borders we draw on maps or in our minds, the genes themselves were never paying attention to any of it, and they still are not now.